I started off in my adult life, when I embarked on a spiritual path, I really went for it. I gave away all my possessions. I pretty much took a vow of poverty. I was celibate for a while. I was really trying to follow those Eastern precepts that they're very similar in both Hinduism and Buddhism, about at least, retracting from worldliness, and withdrawing your senses from the objects of the senses, turning within, so I really, really tried that. I really gave it my best shot. But what I found after some years was for me, that was a path of self-repression. Um, you know, especially when you're a young man, you've got a lot of sexual energy, you've got all kinds of desires, and so it was a lot of emotional repression on top of all the emotional repression I'd received from childhood, and all the emotional repression I'd imposed on myself to succeed in the education system. The society is already encouraging a lot of emotional repression, and maybe that's why the spiritual paths also encourage even more. I don't know. But at some point, I just couldn't do it anymore. I was, I looked good during the day. Was down to one cloth. I was living in a hut. I was living very simply, but at night I had all these repressed desires coming up. And so that path really wasn't working for me. And I had a very significant dream one night. I shared this in the first class, but it didn't make it under recording. It's actually worth sharing. It's a good story. So after pursuing this path very earnestly for several years, really striving to, still my mind and, live very simply, all these things. One night, rather than having my usual dreams, I was literally transported to another planet, another loka, they would call it in Hinduism. It was like a spiritual planet. It seemed like tropical, lush paradise world. Everybody there were just a few beings there. They had like these tall crowns, kind of like you see in some of the paintings. And everyone was just sitting and meditating peacefully, by some waterfall or, some, tropical paradise scene. And I literally spent the whole night in this place. I had no other dreams. That was it. My whole night was there. And when I came back or woke up from that, I thought to myself, if I died today and I went to that place, because that's what I've been so earnestly striving for, I wouldn't want to stay there because I have all these repressed desires and they would just call me right back, And so that was when I really gave up that path of self-repression. That's what I call it now. Listen, anybody who's doing that path, there are a lot of very genuine, great spiritual masters who have followed that path successfully. So I'm not knocking it for anybody who wants to do it, but I'm just saying for me, it wasn't working. And it was at that time that I really embarked on a path I had never read about. I've never heard anybody endorse, but I just decided that's what I had to do, which was to lift the repression, to allow my emotions to express themselves. I thought until the waters run clear. I knew there were a lot of repressed emotions, and I could see from my practice that a repressed emotion was the most difficult thing to overcome. It was more difficult than an emotion that you were seriously pursuing because, there was this repression locking it up. So if it ever built up enough pressure to express itself, it was very furtive and for a short period of time until, the intellect clamped down the lid again and said, no, that's wrong. You're not right to express that. And so those repressed emotions never really got to fully experience themselves. So when I embarked on this path, I really didn't know what was going to happen. But what I started to learn was that the emotions and the emotional body learns things in a different way than the intellect. This is something is obvious in early childhood, I'm sure, but you quickly lose it after the conditioning of this world that teaches you to use your intellect to rule everything, And so, yes, I found that if I just allowed my emotions to express, for example, a desire for some food. Let's say it was some food that I knew really wasn't that good for me, right? but so my mind could say, oh, that's not good for you. You shouldn't eat that. But my emotions wanted to try it out, just like a little child. They wanted to put it in their mouth. They wanted to taste it. They wanted to see what the experience was. And so when I really allowed my emotions to have the full experience, not just what the food tasted like, but what it felt like in my body as it digested, as it assimilated into my system, the whole experience, then if it really was something that made my body not feel good, my emotions would learn that. They wouldn't learn it in a snap like the intellect would, but they would learn it in a few days or a few weeks, and I would literally lose my desire for that food. I didn't have to repress myself. I didn't have to stop myself from doing it. I didn't want it anymore because I had allowed my emotions to learn in their own way. And the reason I'm sharing this is because this is a very significant part of my path. And it's, people see me sometimes, they see me eating a healthy diet, they this or that, and they're like, they admire what I'm doing. And I tell them, I'm like, I'm not forcing myself. It's just what I want to do, and so that's been my discovery, not about just food, but about all kinds of things that are considered, higher spiritual concepts, that, I made my way to those things in my own time, in the time of my emotions, kind of through a winding path. Like I said, there were definitely lots of mistakes and, things that went wrong, but it ended up working for me. Now, obviously, if you're having desires to hurt another person, I would never condone that. There is some restraint that's required to exist in a society. But, short of that, short of really harming other people, there are most of your emotions, you really can allow them to just play out. And if you have some faith in that process, you can see anyway, I don't know if it'll work out the same way it did for you as it did for me, but it's something worth trying, because I'm sure you know very well what it feels like to use the intellect to decide what's right and repress the emotions. You're always at war with yourself when you're doing that. The emotions, the pressure just keeps building up until finally sometimes they blow the lid off. But the problem with that is, that's what, in my opinion, and this is just my own opinion, that's what leads to addictive behavior, because the emotions are never satisfied. When they have to push and push and push against this intellect that's condemning whatever desire they have, until they finally are able to experience it for a short time, while they can build up enough energy to sort of blow the lid off that repression, they never get the full experience. They get a little taste of it, and then boom, the lid comes back down. And so you're really blocking, when you're doing that, you're blocking your emotions from having the full experience. The digestive experience is one thing, to really feel what it's like to have not just the taste, but the whole experience. Another area where that comes up is sexual desires. There may be a certain sexual desire or behavior that you've learned is wrong, or you've decided, you still have it, but you condemn yourself for it. And so that's another one where you're just fighting with yourself, fighting. My experience with that is that, and I mentioned this in another video, that from my strong connection with the earth, because, while I did this, while I allowed my emotions to play out, I did it in a very conscious way. I just changed my attitude. Rather than using my intellect to judge and to suppress things, I used my intellect to observe and analyze things. It's really good at doing that. And so without the energy of being the ruler or the oppressor, I allowed all that information to kind of feed into the whole system. There's like three brains. There's the gut brain, there's the heart brain, and there's the one up here. So I was, basically what I was doing was allowing those three brains to communicate with each other and share the information, and each of them, again, learns in its own way and has a different way of perceiving the world and feeling the world. And so so when I was in that process, with the intellect observing, I was still on my spiritual path, I just decided this was my spiritual path. Rather than using the intellect to decide what's right and wrong and to try to follow that, I decided to use the intellect just to observe and to analyze and see how each experience would lead me closer to that state of, I wasn't sure what that state felt like, but whatever was that state I was desiring of greater union or feeling of oneness or communion with some larger divine source or consciousness. Of course, in the beginning, I didn't know what that was. You hear about it, and sounds great, but you're reaching for something that you're not sure of. So that's what I found. Eventually, it did, because that was my desire too. That was a sincere desire. So it was coming from my gut brain. It was coming, or maybe not. It was coming from that sincere desire part of me that wanted that experience, and because I wanted it, I allowed whatever happened in my life to lead me there. Now, some people would call that a tantric path, although, tantra literally means to weave, and that's come to mean many different things in different traditions. Typically, it means weaving different rituals and ceremonies and ways of experiencing life into a spiritual path. What I did, like I said, is something I've never heard of before. So I just wanted to share that with you a little bit about my practice, because it might help you with this practice, because what that practice did for me was it really opened up my channel, and it really allowed me to start trusting myself. I was taught that I could not trust my emotions in childhood, but I learned that I could, and actually that they had their own wisdom. And just that process of learning to trust myself took away that fight, that always that fighting against myself, so that my emotions were now communicating with my brain and with my heart. And so I had a much more full experience. Rather than using the intellect to judge, I was using it to take in information and to analyze and to see what was working and what wasn't working. And then my emotions also started trusting my intellect. They started trusting the information that was coming from the intellect, because now the intellect was not the oppressor. Now the intellect was giving valuable information that helped refine the emotional feeling sensitivity. So that I thought was worth sharing, because it opens this channel. It opens this channel of trust, and that helps the energy just to flow more freely. It takes away this internal fight. Basically the inner judge, you still have to deal with it at first, but it just starts dissolving after a while. You realize you just don't need it. You just don't need it. Again, there's some reasons for restraint. Sometimes a person gets really mad. They really hate somebody. They really want to kill somebody or something. Obviously you can't do that. So, some restraint is required, but short of that, not very much restraint is really required to function in this world. Again, because as an adult, you've learned how to function in society. So all these things are mostly internal. Most of our experience is internal. It's thoughts in our own mind, self-judgment or self-criticism or all these things. So it really, when you learn to trust yourself, it really takes a lot of that away, and this was not done in a process of sitting in stillness and, going within and retracting from my senses. This was a very active process of being with the emotions as they came up, and learning to work with them, learning to trust myself. So in my daily practice, I really don't sit in stillness all that often. What I do is I clear. I do the practice that I've shared with you. My morning practice is about clearing. I make that connection with the earth. I make that connection with the sun. And in my own case, I connect through the sun to the center of the galaxy. I like to connect with those three big, vast consciousnesses of the earth, the sun, and the galactic center. And, I started with the earth led me to the sun. So I did it all in a very somatic way. And the sun is part of the galaxy. So through the sun, I was able to connect to an even bigger energy. That last part of connecting with the galaxy. The galactic consciousness is really vast. We're talking about a consciousness that is literally embodying, governing, and overseeing hundreds of thousands of millions of stars like our sun and all the planets around them. It's such a huge, vast consciousness. It's very close to the source consciousness because of its vastness. So connecting at that level also helped me open up to the actual source consciousness, because again, it's so close, and also to higher dimensional energy. So these are things that are possible, and not so far out of reach. Once you realize that it's possible to do that, you have a good, again, I always caution people, you must have a good grounding connection with the earth to go into these higher practices, so you don't feel like you're floating away. People, especially with childhood trauma, will often leave their body in childhood. They'll, to try to get away from the trauma that they can't get away from physically. And so those people, as they grow up, they have a pretty strong spiritual connection because they're used to getting up into the astral plane. That was a survival technique in childhood, but they won't have a good grounding for it. And so if they start going up even higher, they really get this floating away feeling because they're not very tethered to their body in the first place. So making that grounding cord with the earth is really important. And for some people, you're going to need some individual assistance to do that. Some people have actual interference at the root chakra, or they have trauma in that area, especially sexual trauma will tend to make a person distrustful about opening at the root chakra. Sometimes you need some individual assistance to really open that root connection so you can do these higher practices. So